The little girl's hands trembled as she held out her final piece of dry bread to the unconscious woman lying in the rain. She had no idea that one small act of kindness would soon make the entire city know her name. And years later, when the truth about that rainy night was finally revealed, millions of people would cry. Julia was only 7 years old when her parents died in a terrible bus accident. No relatives came for her. No one adopted her. No one even asked where she slept at night. From that moment on, the streets became her home. Every morning before sunrise, Julia pushed an old broken cart through the alleys, collecting plastic bottles and scrap metal just to survive another day. Sometimes she earned enough money to buy a piece of bread. Sometimes she didn't eat at all. But despite her miserable life, Julia never learned how to hate people. She still smiled at strangers. She still helped old people cross the street. And every night before sleeping beside an abandoned market, she whispered the same prayer: "Please, let tomorrow be kinder." One freezing evening, heavy rain poured across the city. Julia walked barefoot beside the road, holding a tiny bag of scraps she hoped to sell in the morning. That was when she saw it. A black luxury car had stopped near the sidewalk. A woman in elegant clothes stumbled out of the back seat, then suddenly collapsed onto the wet pavement. Cars passed. People stared, but nobody stopped. Julia hesitated for only 1 second before running toward her. Auntie, are you okay?" The woman's face was pale. Her lips were shaking from the cold. Julia looked around desperately, but everyone ignored them. Then the little girl slowly opened her own plastic bag. Inside was the only food she had saved for dinner: a small, dry piece of bread. Julia swallowed hard. She was starving, but she still placed the bread gently into the woman's hand. "Please eat. You need it more than me." Moments later, the woman weakly opened her eyes, and the very first thing she saw was a soaked little orphan girl trying to protect her from the rain with her own torn jacket. The woman stared silently at Julia. Then tears slowly filled her eyes, because Julia had no idea the woman she had just saved was one of the richest billionaires in the entire country. And at that exact moment, a black secret from the billionaire's past was about to change Julia's life forever. The billionaire searched for the little orphan girl all night, but by morning, Julia had vanished without a trace. And what the woman discovered next would break her heart forever. The woman's name was Eleanor Whitmore, owner of one of the largest fashion companies in the country. People feared her power. Newspapers called her the Ice Queen billionaire, but none of them knew the truth. Behind the expensive jewelry and cold expression, Eleanor had been carrying unbearable pain for years. 10 years earlier, she had lost her own daughter in a tragic kidnapping case. The child was never found, not alive, not dead, just gone. Since that day, Eleanor stopped trusting people, stopped smiling, stopped believing kindness still existed in the world. But somehow, that tiny orphan girl standing in the rain had touched something buried deep inside her heart. After recovering at the hospital, Eleanor immediately ordered her assistants, "Find that little girl. No matter how long it takes. She saved my life." Meanwhile, Julia knew nothing about any of this. The next morning, she continued collecting bottles near the market as if nothing had happened. Her stomach hurt from hunger. Her feet were bleeding from walking barefoot in the cold rain all night. But she still smiled at a homeless old man and shared the last apple she found in the trash. Hours later, a black luxury car suddenly stopped beside her. Several men in expensive suits stepped out. Julia froze in fear. Had she done something wrong? One man approached carefully. "Are you Julia?" The little girl slowly nodded. "Our boss wants to see you." Julia panicked instantly. "I didn't steal anything." "I'm sorry." The men exchanged shocked glances even after suffering so much. The first thing this child felt was fear. Not trust, not hope, fear at the mansion. Julia stared silently at the enormous golden gates. She had never seen a house so beautiful in her life. When Eleanor walked into the room and saw the little girl again, her eyes immediately turned red. Julia looked even thinner in daylight. Her clothes were torn. Her hands were covered in tiny cuts. And yet, she still held that same innocent smile. Eleanor knelt slowly in front of her. "Why did you help me last night?" Julia looked confused by the question. "Because you were sick. That's all." Eleanor's lips trembled. Most adults only helped her because of money, because of power, because of fame. But this little girl helped her expecting absolutely nothing. Then Eleanor noticed something around Julia's neck, a tiny silver necklace. Old scratched and hanging from it was half of a broken butterfly pendant. Eleanor suddenly stopped breathing. Her face turned pale instantly because 10 years ago, before her daughter disappeared, she had given her child the exact same necklace. And somewhere in the world, the other half still existed. Eleanor's hands shook violently as she stared at the broken butterfly necklace around Julia's neck, because only two identical necklaces had ever existed. One belonged to her missing daughter, and the other had disappeared the same night the child was kidnapped. What Eleanor discovered next would leave her unable to sleep for days. "Where did you get this necklace?" Eleanor whispered. Julia touched the pendant carefully. "My mother gave it to me before she died." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. "Your mother?" Julia nodded slowly. "She told me never to lose it. She said it was the only thing left from my real family." The room suddenly fell silent. Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes. Could it really be possible? Could this poor little orphan somehow be connected to her lost daughter? No. The ages didn't match. Julia was 7 when her parents died, and Eleanor's daughter had disappeared 10 years ago. Still, something deep inside her refused to let the thought go. That night, Eleanor secretly ordered an investigation. Every detail about Julia. Every hospital record. Every adoption file. Every missing child report from the past 10 years. Meanwhile, Julia sat alone in the giant guest bedroom, terrified to touch anything. The bed was softer than clouds. The room was bigger than the abandoned market where she used to sleep. But instead of happiness, she felt fear. Children like her didn't belong in places like this. When a maid brought warm food, Julia quietly hid half of it inside her pocket. The maid looked confused. "Why are you doing that?" Julia lowered her head shyly. "In case there's no food tomorrow." The maid suddenly covered her mouth, trying not to cry. Because for Julia, hunger was normal. Later that evening, Eleanor watched hidden security footage of Julia eating dinner. The little girl kept thanking the servants after every bite, even for a simple glass of water. Eleanor finally broke down in tears. How much suffering had this child endured to become this grateful for the smallest kindness? But the biggest shock came the next morning. One of Eleanor's investigators rushed into her office, pale and trembling. "Ma'am, we found something." "What is it?" The man hesitated. Then slowly placed an old photograph on the desk. Eleanor grabbed it instantly. And froze. In the photo, a younger version of Julia's mother stood beside. A man Eleanor recognized immediately. A former employee, one who mysteriously disappeared 10 years ago right after Eleanor's daughter was kidnapped. Eleanor's blood turned cold. because the woman who raised Julia might have been connected to the kidnapping all along. And if that was true, then Julia's entire life had been built on a terrible secret. But the most heartbreaking truth, Julia herself knew absolutely nothing. Julia was never supposed to hear the conversation, but one sentence changed everything. You might actually be Eleanor Whitmore's missing daughter. And seconds later, the little orphan girl ran out into the storm with tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt hope. Real hope that she spent the entire night studying old records, photographs, and hospital files. Every clue pointed toward one terrifying possibility. Julia may have been stolen as a baby and raised under a false identity. But Eleanor needed proof, a DNA test. The next morning, Eleanor invited Julia to breakfast in the mansion garden. Fresh pancakes, warm milk, strawberries covered in chocolate. Julia stared at the table in complete disbelief. This is all for me. Eleanor smiled softly. Yes, sweetheart. Julia's eyes instantly filled with cares. Nobody had ever prepared breakfast for her before, not once in her entire life. As Julia carefully ate, Eleanor couldn't stop watching her. The way she smiled, the tiny dimple on her cheek, even the way she held her spoon. It reminded Eleanor painfully of her lost daughter. Then suddenly Julia looked up nervously. Miss Eleanor, if I stay here, can I still collect bottles outside sometimes? Eleanor froze. Why would you want to do that? Julia lowered her eyes. Because homeless people near the market share food with me. I don't want them to think I forgot them. Eleanor had to turn away for a moment. Even after suffering hunger and loneliness, Julia still thought about other people first. At that exact moment, Eleanor silently made a promise. No matter what the DNA test says, this child will never sleep on the streets again. But fate had other plans. Later that afternoon, Julia wandered through the mansion searching for the bathroom. As she passed Eleanor's office, she heard voices inside. She deserves to know the truth. What if she really is your daughter? Julia stopped breathing. Daughter. Another voice answered carefully. If the DNA test confirms it, then the people who raised her may have been involved in the kidnapping. Julia's entire body went numb. Kidnapping? Fake identity. Not her real parents. The little girl backed away slowly in horror. No. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Everything she believed about her life suddenly felt like a lie. Without thinking, Julia turned and ran straight out of the mansion into the cold rain. Servants shouted behind her. Security guards chased after her. But Julia kept running barefoot through the streets, crying harder than ever before. Meanwhile, inside the office, Eleanor suddenly realized Julia had overheard everything. Her face turned white. Julia. Eleanor ran outside in panic. But by then, the little girl was already gone. And standing alone in the pouring rain, Julia whispered the heartbreaking question that shattered her tiny heart. If they weren't my real parents, then why did nobody ever want me? While the DNA test sat unopened on Eleanor's desk, Julia was alone on the streets again. Cold, hungry, and slowly losing consciousness. But before sunrise, Eleanor would discover a truth so devastating it changed both of their lives forever. The storm grew worse through the night. Julia hid beneath an old bridge, hugging her tiny body to stay warm. Rainwater soaked her clothes. Her bare feet were covered in cuts and mud. But the pain inside her heart hurt even more. If they lied to me, then who am I? For the first time in years, Julia cried herself to sleep. Meanwhile, Eleanor searched the entire city. Every alley. Every market. Every abandoned building. Police officers joined the search. Her employees spread photos everywhere. But Julia was nowhere to be found. At 3 a.m., Eleanor finally returned to the mansion completely exhausted. That was when she noticed the envelope waiting on her desk. DNA results. Her hands trembled violently. Part of her wanted to open it immediately. Another part was terrified. What if Julia wasn't her daughter? What if this hope disappeared again? After several painful seconds, Eleanor slowly opened the envelope. She read the paper once, then twice, and suddenly the document slipped from her fingers. Tears instantly flooded her eyes because the result said only 5 words. 99.98% biological match confirmed. Julia was her daughter, her real daughter. The little orphan who saved her in the rain had been the child Eleanor cried for every night over the past 10 years. Eleanor broke down completely. Years of pain exploded out at once. She was alive. My baby was alive this whole time. But the happiness lasted only seconds, because another terrible thought immediately entered her mind. Julia was still out there alone. In the freezing storm. At dawn, a police officer suddenly called Eleanor. We found a child near the river. Eleanor's heart stopped. Minutes later, her car screeched to a halt outside a small emergency clinic. Inside, Julia lay unconscious beneath a thin blanket. Her lips were pale blue from the cold. A doctor rushed toward Eleanor. She has severe fever and exhaustion. She nearly collapsed from hypothermia. Eleanor fell beside the bed, shaking uncontrollably. Julia looked so small. So fragile. The billionaire gently grabbed the little girl's freezing hand and burst into tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. A few minutes later, Julia weakly opened her eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Miss Eleanor. Eleanor couldn't hold back anymore. No, not Miss Eleanor. The woman pressed her forehead against Julia's tiny hand as tears streamed down endlessly. Then finally whispered the words she had waited 10 years to say. I'm your mother. Julia stared at her silently, completely frozen, and one heartbreaking question slowly escaped her trembling lips. If you're really my mother, why didn't you come for me? Julia waited silently for Eleanor's answer. One question, one painful question. If you were really looking for me, why did I grow up alone? And Eleanor's answer shattered both of their hearts. Tears streamed endlessly down Eleanor's face. Because I never stopped searching for you. Her voice broke completely. For 10 years, I searched every city, every orphanage, every missing child report. But someone hid you from me. Julia stared quietly at the woman beside her hospital bed. For the first time in her life, someone was crying because they were afraid of losing her. Eleanor slowly removed a small gold chain from around her own neck. Attached to it was the other half of the butterfly pendant. Julia's hands trembled as the 2 broken pieces fit together perfectly. At that moment, the little girl finally understood the truth. She had never been abandoned. She had been stolen. Days later, the police uncovered the full story. The former employee and Julia's adoptive parents had worked together years ago. After the kidnapping, they fled the city and secretly raised Julia under a different identity. But over time, guilt destroyed them before dying in the accident. Julia's adoptive mother left behind one final letter. A letter addressed to Julia. With shaking hands, Julia opened it. Inside, the woman had written, "We were wrong, but we truly loved you. We wanted to return you many times, but we were afraid. Please forgive us." Julia cried silently while holding the letter against her chest, because despite everything, the people who raised her had still been the ones who hugged her when she was sick. Fed her when they had food. Loved her in the only broken way they knew how. Eleanor gently sat beside her. "Daughter, you don't have to forget them," she whispered. "And you never have to choose between love and truth." For the first time in years, Julia smiled without sadness in her eyes. Months later, Eleanor officially adopted every homeless child living near the abandoned market where Julia once slept. She built shelters, schools, free kitchens, and above the entrance of the largest children's home. A single sentence was written in gold letters. "One act of kindness can change a life forever." As for Julia, she never forgot the streets, never forgot hunger, and never forgot the rainy night that changed everything years later. During a television interview, a reporter asked her, "What was the greatest moment of your life?" Julia smiled softly, not when she became rich, not when the world learned her story, not even when she found her real mother. Instead, she gave one simple answer: "The moment someone finally called me family." And beside her, Eleanor quietly held her daughter's hand, terrified of ever losing it again.